My stepson and I did it in my husband's room while he lay there dying. And I never knew why Jethro always smiled. Afterward until it was too late to save us both. I'm Loretta Mae Williams, 68 years old, and folks around Sparrow Creek know me as the woman who makes the best peach cobbler for the church. Socials and tends to her sick husband with the patience of a saint. They see me in my flowered house dress, walking slow down Main Street with my canvas shopping bag, nodding politely to neighbors who whisper behind my back about how I married Orville Thompson when he was already past 70 and I was just 52. They think they know my story. The younger woman who found herself a comfortable nest with an older man's money. But Lord have mercy, they don't know nothing at all. What I'm about to tell you happened right here in this old farmhouse where I'm sitting now, where the floorboards creak with secrets, and the walls have seen things that would make a preacher weep. It's a story I've carried alone for months now, pressing down on my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe, hard to sleep, hard to look at myself in the mirror each morning when I wash my face with the same hands that, well, you'll understand soon enough. I decided to tell this, 'cause keeping it inside is killing me slower than any disease. And maybe, just maybe, there's someone out there who needs to hear that. Even when you've fallen into the deepest, darkest pit of your own making, there's still a way to find some kind of redemption, some kind of peace. So settle in with me here on this porch, and let me walk you through the shadows of what really happened behind these closed doors. Me show you how love and loneliness can twist into something so ugly it near destroys everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. You know, when I married Orville Thompson 16 years ago, I thought I was getting myself a quiet life with a good man who'd treat me gentle and kind. He was already in his 70s then, silver-haired and slow-moving, but his eyes were still sharp as winter air. And when he looked at me, I felt like I mattered for the first time since my first husband died in that car wreck back in '92. Orville had money enough from his grain business, a big old farmhouse that sat like a white castle on 200 acres of Missouri bottom land. And most importantly, he had loneliness that matched mine. What I didn't count on was inheriting his son. Jethro was already 47 when I came into the picture. A hard man with calloused hands and eyes that never seemed to warm up, no matter how bright the sun was shining. He lived in the old foreman's cottage out back, close enough to help with the farm work, but far enough away that we didn't have to make small talk over breakfast. It suited me just fine because from the very first day I moved my belongings into Orville's bedroom, Jethro made it crystal clear that he thought I was nothing but a gold-digging hussy who'd stolen his daddy's good sense along with his money. The years passed peaceful enough though. Orville and I had our routines. Coffee on the front porch at sunrise. Him reading his farming magazines while I worked on my quilting. Sunday services at Sparrow Creek Methodist where I sang alto in the choir. And he passed the collection plate with the dignity of a man who'd been doing it for 40 years. We traveled some too. Drove down to Branson to see the shows. Took a trip to Colorado one summer to see mountains I'd only dreamed about. We weren't passionate lovers, mind you, but we were companions, and that felt like enough for a woman who'd learned not to ask for too much from life. But then, 3 years ago this past spring, everything changed in the span of a single morning. I found Orville in the kitchen standing in front of the coffee maker with this look on his face like he'd never seen such a contraption before in his life. He was holding the bag of coffee beans, turning it over and over in his hands. And when I asked him what was wrong, he looked at me with these vacant eyes and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I can't seem to remember how this works." Ma'am, like I was a stranger he just met at the grocery store. Doctor in Lebanon called it early onset dementia, though Orville was already 84, so I'm not sure how early it really was. What I do know is that my husband, this man who could tell you the corn futures for the next 6 months and recite Bible verses from memory, started disappearing piece by piece, like someone was erasing him with a slow, cruel hand. First it was the coffee maker. Then the names of neighbors he'd known for 50 years. And he forgot how to button his shirts, how to tie his shoes, how to find the bathroom in his own house. Within 6 months, he couldn't remember my name most days, and by winter, he was bedridden, requiring round-the-clock care that Medicare wouldn't cover, and that I couldn't possibly manage alone. That's when Jethro moved back into the main house. For Daddy's sake, he told me, carrying his duffel bag up to his old bedroom like he'd never left. Someone's got to help you lift him, help you turn him, help you with all the things a woman can't do by herself. I was grateful. Lord, forgive me. I was so grateful to have the help, even if it came with Jethro's cold stares and the way he'd watch me struggle with the bedpan or the feeding tube like he was keeping score of all my failures as a caretaker. We fell into a routine of necessity. Him lifting Orville while I changed the sheets. Me preparing the meals while he administered the medications. Both of us taking turns. Sitting with Orville through the long quiet nights when his breathing got shallow. And we wondered if this might be the night he finally slipped away into whatever comes after. But somewhere in all that routine something started shifting between Jethro and me. Something I should have recognized for the danger it was. And it was in those dark, exhausted hours beside my dying husband's bed that I made the first mistake that would damn us both. First time I noticed something different about Jethro was on a Tuesday night in October when the air had that crisp bite that makes you want to pull your sweater closer and breathe deep. I was sitting in the wooden chair beside Orville's bed, the one that had belonged to his grandmother, and still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she used to tuck into the cushions. Orville had been restless all evening, making those soft whimpering sounds that broke my heart. Because I knew he was trying to say something, but the words just wouldn't come anymore. Jethro appeared in the doorway around 10 o'clock, his hair still damp from a shower, wearing a clean flannel shirt that made him look younger. Somehow, less like the angry man who'd spent the day glowering at me over breakfast. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the door frame, watching me smooth Orville's blanket for the 100th time that day, my hands moving in the same gentle circles I'd been making for months now, trying to bring him some kind of comfort, even though I wasn't sure he could feel it anymore. That's when Jethro did something that surprised me more than if he'd slapped me across the face. He walked over to the other side of the bed, pulled up the old rocking chair that had been gathering dust in the corner, and sat down without a word. He stayed there for 2 hours just watching his daddy breathe, sometimes reaching out to adjust a pillow or straighten the sheet. His movements careful and tender, in a way I'd never seen from him before. When I finally got up to stretch my aching back, my hand accidentally brushed against his as we both reached to tuck the blanket around Orville's shoulders at the same time. Touch lasted maybe 3 seconds, but something passed between us in that moment. Something warm and electric that made me pull my hand back like I'd touched a hot stove. Jethro looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, his eyes weren't cold. That became our new routine. Every night around 10, Jethro would appear in that doorway, clean and quiet, and take his place in the rocking chair while I kept my vigil in the wooden one. We hardly spoke, but somehow the silence between us changed from hostile to something else. Something that felt almost like companionship. We'd share looks when Orville had a particularly bad coughing fit, or when he'd suddenly grab at the air like he was trying to catch something only he could see. Sometimes our hands would meet again when we were adjusting his position, and each time that spark would jump between us, growing stronger and more dangerous. I started looking forward to those nighttime hours in a way that made me feel guilty and confused. During the day, when Jethro was out checking the fence lines or fixing the barn door that had been hanging crooked since last spring storms, I'd catch myself listening for the sound of his truck coming up the gravel drive. I'd find myself taking extra care with my appearance, changing out of my old house dress into something newer, brushing my gray hair until it shone in the lamplight. I told myself it was just because it felt good to have another human being to share the burden with, someone who understood what it was like to watch a man you cared about fade away, inch by inch. But that wasn't the whole truth, and I knew it. The whole truth was that somewhere in those quiet October nights, I'd started noticing things about Jethro that I'd never allowed myself to see before. The way his large hands could be so gentle when he was washing Orville's face with a warm cloth. The way he'd hum old hymns under his breath while he worked. The same ones his daddy used to sing while he was shaving. The way his voice got soft and careful when he'd tell Orville about his day, talking to him like he could still understand every word. One night in early November, when the first frost had killed the last of my garden roses, and the house felt colder than usual despite the furnace running, I brought 2 cups of coffee upstairs during our watch. Jethro accepted his without comment, but when our fingers touched around the warm ceramic mug, neither of us pulled away. We sat there for the longest time, drinking coffee that had grown cold while we pretended to watch Orville sleep. Both of us, knowing we were really watching each other in the reflection of the bedroom window. That's when I realized I was in trouble. The kind of trouble that starts small and quiet, but grows into something that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. But I wasn't careful. Lord help me. I wasn't careful. Oh, I should have seen what was coming. I should have recognized the way Jethro's smiles were starting to look different. Like he knew something I didn't. Like he was keeping a secret that would change everything. But I was too lonely, too hungry for human connection, too desperate to feel something other than grief and exhaustion to pay attention to the warning signs that were right there in front of me. The night everything changed was December 3rd. A date I'll remember until the day I die because it was the night I stopped being Orville's wife and became something else entirely. Something I still don't have a proper name for. It had been snowing since morning, the kind of heavy wet snow that makes the whole world look clean and new, but turns the roads into treacherous ribbons of ice. Power had flickered twice during dinner, and by the time we'd settled into our usual chairs beside Orville's bed, the wind was howling around the corners of the old house like a living thing trying to get in. I'd lit 2 kerosene lanterns, just in case the electricity gave out completely, and their warm yellow light made everything in the room look softer, more intimate than usual. Orville had been having one of his bad days, the kind where he couldn't keep anything down, and his breathing sounded like paper rustling in his chest. I'd spent most of the afternoon trying to coax him to take a few sips of the beef broth I'd made from scratch, but he just kept turning his head away, his eyes focusing on something the rest of us couldn't see. By evening I was worn down to nothing, my nerves frayed like the edges of an old quilt that's been washed too many times. That's when Jethro did something that should have set off every alarm bell in my head, but instead felt like the most natural thing in the world. He got up from his rocking chair, walked around to where I was sitting, and placed his hands on my shoulders. His touch was warm and firm, and when he started kneading the knots of tension that had been building there for weeks, I let out a sound that was part relief and part something else entirely. I should have pulled away. I should have told him that wasn't appropriate, that we needed to maintain proper boundaries even in our shared exhaustion. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my eyes closing as his strong fingers worked out months of grief and worry that I'd been carrying in my shoulders and neck. It felt so good to be touched by another human being, to feel cared for instead of always being the one doing the caring. When he leaned down and whispered that I was working too hard, that I needed to take better care of myself, his breath was warm against my ear, and I felt something inside me that had been sleeping for years suddenly wake up. I turned to look at him, meaning to thank him for his kindness, but the words died in my throat when I saw the way he was looking me. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were dark and intense and hungry in a way that made my pulse quicken and my mouth go dry. We stayed like that for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. His hands still on my shoulders, my face turned up toward his. Both of us breathing a little too fast, while Orville's labored breathing provided a terrible soundtrack to whatever was happening between us. I could feel the exact moment when we crossed from grieving family members, sharing comfort, to something else entirely, something dangerous and wrong and irresistible. That's when I noticed the first thing that should have warned me. If I'd been thinking clearly instead of drowning in loneliness and need. Jethro pulled back, breaking the spell between us. There was the smallest smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Not the smile of a man who just realized he was attracted to his stepmother, but something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for this moment, planning for it, even. But I was too shaken by my own reaction to pay proper attention to his. All I could think about was how good it had felt to be touched, how much I wanted him to put his hands on me again, how wrong and shameful those once were. I spent the rest of the night in a state of confusion and self-rumination, barely able to look at Jethro, jumping every time he moved or spoke. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the tension between us was worse, crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. We moved around each other carefully, both of us hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. When we were both reaching for the same bottle of pills to give Orville his morning medication, and our hands met, the jolt of awareness that shot through me was so strong I actually gasped out loud. Jethro heard it, and when I looked up, that same small smile was there again, like he was pleased by my reaction, like he'd been expecting it. That's when I knew we were past the point of pretending this was just grief and exhaustion making us behave strangely. Something fundamental had shifted between us, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The question wasn't whether something was going to happen between us anymore. The question was when and what it would cost us both when it did. Happened on a Thursday night in January when the temperature had dropped so low that the windows were covered in thick sheets of ice and the old furnace was struggling to keep the house warm. Orville had been unconscious for 3 days straight, his breathing so shallow that I had to put my ear close to his chest just to make sure he was still with us. The hospice nurse had warned me this was likely the beginning of the end, that we should prepare ourselves for him to slip away any time now. I'd been sitting in that wooden chair for so long that my whole body ached afraid to leave his side even for a few minutes, in case those precious last breaths came while I was downstairs making coffee or heating up another can of soup I wouldn't be able to eat anyway. My eyes burned from crying and from staring at Orville's still face, willing him to wake up one more time to give me one more moment of recognition before he left me completely alone in this world. That's when Jethro appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and a plate of the sugar cookies I'd made for Christmas, but hadn't had the heart to. He set the tray down on the bedside table and handed me one of the mugs, his fingers lingering against mine longer than necessary. The chocolate was rich and sweet, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days. When I thanked him for his thoughtfulness, my voice came out as barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse and grief. He sat down in his rocking chair and told me I needed to take better care of myself, that Orville wouldn't want me to waste away from not eating or sleeping. Then he said something that made my heart skip in a way that felt both wonderful and terrible at the same time. He said he couldn't bear to watch me suffer like this, that seeing me in pain was breaking his heart too. Before I could think about what I was doing, I was out of my chair and kneeling beside his, my head resting against his knee, while I finally let out all the tears I'd been holding back for months. He stroked my hair with those gentle hands I'd grown to depend on, murmuring soft words of comfort, while I sobbed against his leg, like a child. When I finally looked up at him, my face wet with tears and probably red and blotchy, he cooped my cheek in his palm and told me I was still beautiful, even in my grief. That's when it happened. He leaned down and kissed me, soft and sweet at first, then with increasing urgency as I kissed him back with all the loneliness and need I'd been trying to suppress. His hands tangled in my hair and I could taste the hot chocolate on his lips, could smell the clean scent of his soap and the faint trace of winter air that still clung to his clothes. We made love right there on the floor beside Orville's bed, with my dying husband not 3 feet away from us, his labored breathing the only sound besides our whispered endearments and muffled cries of pleasure. It was wrong in every possible way, a betrayal so profound that I knew I'd carry the shame of it for the rest of my life. But it was also the most alive I'd felt in months, the most connected to another human being I'd been since Orville's mind started slipping away from me. Afterward, as we lay tangled together on the old braided rug that had been in that room since Orville's first wife was alive, I felt a mixture of guilt and relief that left me dizzy and confused. Jethro held me close, stroking my back while I tried to make sense of what we'd just done. Tried to figure out how I was going to live with myself, knowing that I'd committed adultery while my husband lay dying just inches away from us. But when I looked up at Jethro's face in the lamplight, expecting to see the same confusion and remorse I was feeling, what I saw instead made my blood run cold. He was smiling, not with the tender satisfaction of a man who just made love to a woman he cared about, but with something else entirely, something that looked almost like triumph, like he just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. When I asked him what he was thinking about, he just kissed the top of my head and told me not to worry about anything, that everything was going to work out exactly the way it was supposed to. But that smile stayed on his face. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January cold seeping through the old windows. Told myself I was being paranoid, that grief and guilt were making me see things that weren't really there. Deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew something wasn't right about the way Jethro was acting. Just had no idea how wrong things really were or how much worse they were about to get. The affair continued through the rest of January and into February, becoming as much a part of our routine as checking Orville's pulse or changing his bed sheets. Every night after we'd given him his medications and settled him for the evening, Jethro and I would find ourselves drawn together like moths to a flame, making love in corners of the house where we thought God couldn't see us, though I knew in my heart that He saw everything. We'd couple in the spare bedroom down the hall on the living room sofa while Orville slept upstairs once, even in the kitchen, against the counter where I'd made thousands of meals for the man who was dying one breath at a time just above our heads. Each time felt like the last time, and each time I told myself I had the strength to stop this madness, to return to being the faithful wife I'd always been. But then Jethro would touch me with those work-roughened hands, would whisper things in my ear that made me feel young and desired again, and my resolve would crumble like sugar in the rain. What troubled me most wasn't the guilt, though that was eating me alive from the inside out. It was the way Jethro seemed to be growing more confident, more possessive with each passing day. He'd started making comments about what we'd do after Orville passed, talking about how we could travel together, maybe even get married once a proper mourning period had passed. He'd mention how the farm would need someone to run it, how I'd need a man to take care of the business side of things, since women weren't naturally suited to handling finances and legal matters. Those conversations made my skin crawl, not because I disagreed with him about needing help, but because of the assumption in his voice like my future had already been decided without my input. When I try to change the subject or suggest that we shouldn't be making plans while Orville was still alive, Jethro would get this look on his face, patient but firm, like he was dealing with a child who didn't understand the adult world. It was during one of these conversations in mid-February that he said something that made me stop dead in my tracks. We were in the kitchen after another one of our encounters, both of us still breathing hard and trying to straighten our clothes, when he mentioned how fortunate it was that Orville's decline had been so rapid and complete. He said it like he was commenting on the weather, casual and matter-of-fact, but something about the way he said it made my blood freeze in my veins. When I asked him what he meant by that, he just shrugged and said that some folks linger for years in that state, becoming a burden on their families, draining away life savings on medical care that doesn't really help anybody. He said at least Orville was going quickly, peacefully, without putting us through years of suffering and financial hardship. The practical truth of what he was saying couldn't be denied, but the coldness in his voice when he said it made me feel sick to my stomach. This was his father we were talking about. The man who'd raised him, loved him, provided for him his whole life. Even if Jethro was adopted, which I'd suspected for years based on how different they looked, that shouldn't matter when it came to basic human compassion. That night, as I lay in my own bed for the first time in weeks, instead of falling asleep in Jethro's arms, I started really thinking about the timeline of Orville's illness. The more I thought about it, the more certain things began to bother me. How quickly he'd deteriorated after that first morning with the coffee maker. How the symptoms had progressed in such a steady, predictable way. Jethro had been so prepared to step in and help with the medications, already knowing the routine like he'd been planning for it. I remembered the morning I'd found Orville confused in the kitchen. How Jethro had appeared within minutes like he'd been waiting nearby. I remembered how he'd already had a list of doctors and specialists. How he'd known exactly which questions to ask and which forms to fill out. At the time, I'd been grateful for his preparedness, assuming it came from watching other farming families deal with aging parents. But now, lying in the dark with the weight of my sins pressing down on my chest like a stone, I started wondering if there might be another explanation for Jethro's readiness to step into the role of caregiver and decision-maker. What if Orville's rapid decline wasn't as natural as the doctors had assumed? What if someone had been helping it along, ensuring that the progression stayed on schedule? The thought was so terrible, so unthinkable that I pushed it away immediately. But once it had taken root in my mind, I couldn't quite shake it loose, no matter how hard I tried. Doubt that had planted itself in my mind that February night grew like a cancer over the following weeks, spreading through my thoughts until I couldn't look at Jethro without wondering what he might be capable of. I started paying closer attention to things I'd never questioned before. Watching him with Orville during the daily medication routine, noting how he always insisted on being the one to prepare the pills and measure out the liquid medicines. Told myself I was being ridiculous, that grief and guilt were making me paranoid and suspicious of the one person who'd been helping me through the worst time of my life. After all, what possible motive could Jethro have for harming his own father? Orville had always been generous with him, had given him work on the farm and a place to live, had never shown him anything but kindness and patience, even when Jethro's drinking had gotten bad in his younger years. But then I remembered something that made my hands shake as I was folding laundry one March afternoon 2 years ago, before Orville got sick. There had been talk about updating his will. He'd mentioned wanting to make sure I was taken care of if something happened to him. Had even made an appointment with his lawyer in Lebanon to discuss adding me as a beneficiary to some of his accounts and maybe leaving me a life estate in the house. Appointment never happened because Orville had gotten food poisoning the night before and spent the next week too weak to drive anywhere. By the time he felt better, other things had come up and he'd never rescheduled. Within a few months after that, his memory started getting fuzzy and legal matters became too confusing for him to handle. Completely forgotten about that conversation until now. But as I stood there holding one of Orville's old work shirts that I'd been avoiding washing because it still smelled like him, I wondered if Jethro had known about his father's intentions. I wondered if that knowledge might have motivated him to make sure Orville's mental decline happened before any changes could be made to his legal documents. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how convenient the timing had been. Orville's confusion had started just a few months after he'd expressed interest in changing his will. The progression had been steady, but not so dramatic that it raised suspicions. And Jethro had been right there from the beginning, helpful and concerned, taking charge of medical decisions and making sure Orville got the best possible care. What if that care included something extra in his daily medications? Something that would ensure his condition continued to worsen on a predictable timeline. I started finding excuses to be present when Jethro administered Orville's pills, watching carefully as he sorted them out and crushed the ones that were too large for Orville to swallow safely. Everything looked normal and professional, exactly what the doctors had prescribed. But there were so many different medications now, so many bottles lined up on the dresser that it would be easy to slip something additional into the mix without anyone noticing. One evening in late March, when Jethro was out checking on the cattle, I finally worked up the courage to examine those medicine bottles more closely. Most of them were clearly labeled with Orville's name and the prescribing doctor's information, exactly what I expected to see. But tucked behind the others I found 2 Small bottles with handwritten labels that I didn't recognize. The writing wasn't Jethro, and it wasn't any doctors I'd ever seen. The labels just had abbreviations and numbers that didn't mean anything to me. But something about those bottles made my skin crawl. They were hidden deliberately, pushed back where they wouldn't be noticed during routine medication times, and they were nearly empty, like they'd been used regularly over a long period. When I heard Jethro's truck coming up the drive, I quickly put everything back the way I'd found it and went downstairs to start dinner, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he'd be able to hear it. Through our meal, I watched his face for any sign that he suspected what I'd been doing, but he was as calm and pleasant as always, telling me about his day and asking if I needed him to pick up anything in town tomorrow. That night, when he tried to initiate our usual intimate encounter, I found myself making excuses, claiming I was too tired and worried about Orville to be in the mood. Jethro accepted my rejection gracefully, but I caught him watching me with an expression I'd never seen before, calculating and cold, like he was trying to figure out what had changed. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to Orville's labored breathing through the thin walls, I realized I was caught in a trap of my own making. If my suspicions were correct, I was sleeping with a man who was slowly murdering his own father. But I had no proof, no way to confirm what was in those mysterious bottles, and no one I could turn to for help without revealing my own shameful behavior. Worse yet, I was beginning to suspect that my affair with Jethro wasn't the spontaneous result of grief and loneliness I'd convinced myself it was. What if it had been planned from the beginning, part of a larger strategy to ensure my silence and complicity in whatever he was doing to Orville? The first week of April brought an early warm spell that had the daffodils blooming along the front walk and the old maple tree in the yard budding out in that tender green that makes your heart ache with hope. Under normal circumstances, I would have been out there working in my flower beds, getting ready to plant the tomatoes and peppers I started from seed every year in the mudroom. But nothing about my circumstances was normal anymore. And instead of celebrating the arrival of spring, I found myself trapped in a nightmare that was getting darker and more tangled with each passing day. Suspicions about those mysterious medicine bottles had been eating away at me for weeks, but I hadn't been able to work up the courage to investigate further. Every time I thought about confronting Jethro or trying to get the bottles analyzed somehow, I'd remember what I'd have to admit about our relationship, and my resolve would crumble like old mortar. How could I accuse him of poisoning his father when I was sleeping with him in that same father's house under the same roof where Orville lay dying? But then something happened that changed everything and forced me to act whether I was ready or not. I was in the kitchen that Thursday morning trying to force down a piece of toast that tasted like sawdust in my mouth when I heard Jethro talking on his cell phone out on the back porch. He was speaking quietly, probably thinking I couldn't hear him through the screen door, but the morning air was still, and his voice carried clearer than he realized. What I heard made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. He was talking to someone about Orville's condition, giving an update that sounded medical and professional. But it wasn't the words themselves that terrified me. It was the tone he was using, clinical and detached, like he was reporting on a science experiment rather than his dying father. He mentioned that the timeline was proceeding exactly as expected, that there hadn't been any complications or unexpected improvements, and that they should be able to finalize everything within the next few weeks. When he said that part about finalizing everything, he laughed. A sound so cold and calculating that it made my hands shake so badly I had to set down my coffee cup before I dropped it. Then he said something that will haunt me until the day I die. He said that his stepmother was proving to be very cooperative and that he didn't anticipate any problems from that direction. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I wasn't just a grieving woman who'd fallen into an inappropriate relationship. It was a pawn in some kind of game, and Jethro had been playing me from the very beginning. I managed to get myself upstairs and into the bathroom before I started vomiting, my body rejecting not just the food I'd tried to eat, but the horrible reality of what I'd stumbled into. As I knelt there on the cold tile floor, gripping the edges of the toilet bowl, while my stomach heaved, I tried to piece together what I'd learned and figure out what it meant for me and for Orville. If Jethro was deliberately hastening his father's death, then our affair wasn't a product of grief and loneliness bringing us together. It was a calculated move on his part to ensure my silence and cooperation. Every kiss, every tender word, every moment of passion we'd shared had been part of his strategy to make me complicit in his crime. He'd seduced me not because he cared about me but because he needed to control me. The worst part was realizing how perfectly his plan had worked. I was already guilty of adultery, already compromised in ways that would destroy my reputation and my standing in the community if they ever came to light. Who would believe my accusations against him when I'd have to admit that I'd been sleeping with my stepson while my husband lay dying in the next room? Even if I could prove that Jethro was poisoning Orville, I'd still be seen as a wicked woman who'd betrayed her marriage vows in the most shameful way possible. But as I sat there on the bathroom floor wiping my mouth with a washcloth and trying to steady my breathing, I realized I couldn't let my own shame prevent me from trying to save Orville. Even if it meant destroying myself in the process, I had to find a way to stop what was happening and get my husband the help he needed. The first step was getting those mysterious medicine bottles analyzed. But that presented its own set of problems. Couldn't take them to our local pharmacy without raising questions I wasn't prepared to answer. I couldn't go to the police without evidence. And I couldn't get evidence without admitting how I'd discovered the bottles in the first place. That's when I remembered that my sister Ruth lived in Springfield, about 2 hours away, and her daughter worked as a lab technician at the hospital there. If I could get a sample of whatever was in those bottles to someone who could test it without asking too many questions, I might be able to get the proof I needed. But getting a sample meant going back into that room where Jethro kept the medications, and I knew he'd been watching me more carefully. Since the night I'd seemed reluctant to be intimate with him. He had a way of appearing whenever I was anywhere near Orville's room during the day, always with some reasonable excuse, but clearly keeping track of my movements. I decided to wait until he made one of his evening trips out to check on the livestock, something he did religiously every night around 8 o'clock. It usually took him at least 30 minutes to walk the fence lines and make sure all the gates were secure, which should give me enough time to get upstairs, extract small samples from those bottles, and get back downstairs before he returned. The plan worked perfectly until the very end. We managed to get into the room, locate the suspicious bottles, and transfer tiny amounts of their contents into small envelopes I'd prepared ahead of time. I was just putting everything back in its original position when I heard Jethro's truck coming up the drive much earlier than expected. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst as I hurried to get everything arranged exactly the way I'd found it. But in my panic, I knocked over one of the regular prescription bottles. Pills scattered across the dresser top, and I had to scramble to gather them up and get them back in the right container before Jethro came upstairs. I made it back to the kitchen just as he was coming through the back door, and I tried to act normal as I asked him how everything looked outside. But when he kissed me hello the way he always did when he came in from his evening rounds, I could tell he knew something was different. His eyes searched my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And when he told me I looked flushed, there was a question in his voice that I didn't dare try to answer. That night, as we went through our usual routine of checking on Orville and preparing for bed, I felt like I was walking on the edge of a cliff in the dark, never knowing when the ground might give way beneath my feet. I had the samples I needed, hidden in my jewelry box, where I prayed Jethro would never think to look. But I also had the terrifying knowledge that he suspected something, and I wasn't sure how much time I had before he figured out exactly what I'd discovered. The drive to Springfield the next morning felt like the longest 2 hours of my life. Even though I'd made that same trip dozens of times over the years to visit Ruth and her family, this time was different though. This time I was carrying what might be evidence of murder wrapped in tissue paper inside my purse. And every mile that passed brought me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I was strong enough to handle. Told Jethro I was going to visit my sister because she'd been having some health problems and needed someone to drive her to a doctor's appointment. It wasn't a complete lie. Ruth had been dealing with high blood pressure lately, and she'd mentioned needing to see a specialist. But the real reason for my trip was tucked away in those small envelopes, and I prayed to God that my suspicions would turn out to be wrong, that whatever was in those bottles would prove to be harmless supplements or maybe medications that Jethro had gotten for himself and just stored in the wrong place. Ruth's daughter Kelly worked the day shift at Mercy Hospital, and I'd called ahead to let her know I was coming for a visit. Kelly had always been a sweet girl, quiet and studious, the kind of person who chose a career in medical lab work because she genuinely wanted to help people. When I explained that I needed a favor, that I had some substances I was worried might be harmful and needed them tested discreetly, she didn't ask too many questions. She just told me to bring them by the lab during her lunch break. The results came back faster than I'd expected, and they were worse than my darkest fears had imagined. Kelly's face was pale when she called me into a small conference room away from the other hospital staff. She laid the test results on the table between us, and even though I couldn't understand most of the medical terminology, the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. The substances I'd brought her were compounds that, when administered in small doses over time, would mimic the symptoms of progressive dementia and neurological decline. They were sophisticated, the kind of thing that would require medical knowledge to obtain and use effectively, and they were absolutely lethal when used in the dosages that the residue suggested. Kelly asked me where I'd gotten these samples, her voice careful and professional, but I could see the concern in her eyes. When I told her I couldn't explain the circumstances, but that I believed someone was using them to harm a family member, she was quiet for a long moment before telling me that I needed to contact the police immediately. She said that what I'd discovered was evidence of attempted murder. Possibly even successful murder, depending on how long the poisoning had been going on. The drive home felt even longer than the trip to Springfield, partly because I kept having to pull over when the shaking in my hands got so bad I couldn't grip the steering wheel properly. I had the proof I'd been dreading to find, but I still had no idea what I was going to do with it. Going to the police would mean explaining how I discovered the poison, which would mean admitting to my affair with Jethro, which would mean destroying whatever remained of my reputation and possibly facing criminal charges of my own for adultery and failing to report a crime. But more importantly, I was terrified of what Jethro might do if he discovered that I knew about his plan. I'd seen a side of him that I'd never noticed before. Cold and calculating, capable of slowly murdering his own father for money. What would he do to me if he realized I was a threat to his scheme? By the time I pulled into our driveway, the sun was setting behind the barn, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of happier times when Orville and I used to sit on the front porch, watching the evening light fade over the fields. Those fields felt like a prison, and the house that had once been my sanctuary felt like a trap I might never escape. Jethro was waiting for me in the kitchen when I came through the back door, and the moment I saw his face, I knew he'd discovered what I'd done. There was no warmth in his expression, no pretense of concern for my sister's health or curiosity about how my day had gone. Instead, there was something cold and predatory in his eyes that made my blood freeze in my veins. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me set down my purse and remove my coat with movements that felt clumsy and obvious under his scrutiny. When I finally worked up the courage to ask him how Orville had been during the day, he smiled, but it wasn't the gentle smile I'd grown accustomed to over the past few months. This smile was sharp and dangerous, like the edge of a knife. That's when he told me he'd found the empty envelopes in my jewelry box. My heart stopped beating for what felt like a full minute as the implications of his words sank in. He'd been through my personal belongings while I was gone, searching for evidence that I might be investigating him. He'd found the residue from the samples I'd taken, and now he knew that I knew what he was doing to his father. What happened next will stay with me for the rest of my life, however long or short that might turn out to be. Jethro walked over to where I was standing by the kitchen counter, and he placed his hands on either side of me, trapping me against cabinets. When he leaned in close, his voice was soft and conversational, like he was discussing the weather or asking what I wanted for dinner. He told me that he'd been planning this for over 2 years, ever since he'd learned that Orville was considering changing his will to include me as a beneficiary. He explained that as an adopted son, he had no legal claim to the farm or the money. If Orville decided to leave everything to his wife instead, he said he'd researched the substances carefully, choosing compounds that would mimic natural neurological decline and wouldn't show up in routine medical. But the most chilling part of his confession was when he explained that seducing me had been part of his plan. From the very beginning, he'd known that a woman in my position, isolated and grieving, would be vulnerable to the attention of a younger man. He'd calculated that an affair would make me complicit in his crime, that my shame and guilt would ensure my silence, even if I discovered what he was doing. And now that I had discovered it, he wanted to make sure I understood exactly what my options were. He could go to the police himself and tell them about our affair, painting me as a woman who'd seduced her stepson and then tried to frame him for murder when the relationship went sour. Or I could keep quiet, continue our relationship until Orville died naturally from the poison he'd been administering, and then we could be together openly with no one the wiser about how any of it had really happened. As I stood there trapped between his arms and the kitchen counter, listening to him lay out my choices with the calm rationality of a man discussing a business transaction, I realized that I was no longer just a witness to murder. I was now officially his accomplice, whether I wanted to be or not. That night was the longest of my entire life, and I've lived through some dark times, let me tell you. After Jethro laid out my options with that cold business-like tone that made my skin crawl, he went upstairs to check on Orville like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just confessed to slowly murdering his own father and blackmailing me into silence. I stood in that kitchen for what felt like hours, my legs shaking so badly I had to grip the counter to keep from collapsing, trying to wrap my mind around the nightmare my life had become. When he came back downstairs, he acted like we were just a normal couple going through our evening routine. He asked if I wanted to watch television, mentioned that there was a good movie starting on the classic film channel, even offered to make us some popcorn like we used to do in those early days of our affair, when I still thought what we were doing was about grief and comfort and two lonely people finding solace in each other's arms. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't sit next to him on that sofa. Couldn't let him touch me, couldn't act like everything was normal, when I knew what kind of monster he really was. When I told him I wasn't feeling well and wanted to go to bed early, he just nodded and said he understood that it had been a stressful day for both of us. But the way he looked at me when he said it made it clear that he was giving me time to process what he told me, time to come to terms with my new reality as his unwilling partner in crime. I went upstairs and sat in the chair beside Orville's bed, watching him struggle for each breath while I tried to figure out what I was going to do. My husband looked so frail lying there, his skin almost translucent in the lamplight, his once strong hands now nothing but skin and bone resting on top of the quilt I'd made for our 5th wedding anniversary. He'd lost so much weight that his wedding ring had slipped off weeks ago, and I'd put it in the drawer of his nightstand for safekeeping, thinking I'd give it back to him when he got better. Now I knew he was never going to get better. He was going to die from the poison his son had been feeding him, and there wasn't anything I could do to stop it without destroying myself in the process. That's when I made the decision that I pray God will forgive me for. Even though I'm not sure I'll ever be able to forgive myself, I decided to give Orville one last gift, one final act of love that Jethro couldn't take away from him or twist into something ugly and selfish. I was going to tell him the truth, even if he couldn't understand it, even if it was too late to save him. He deserved to know that someone had figured out what was happening to him, that his death wasn't going unnoticed or unmourned. Pulled my chair closer to his bed and took his hand in both of mine, feeling how cold his skin was, even though the room was warm. Then I started talking to him in a whisper, telling him everything I discovered about Jethro and the poison, and the plan to steal his inheritance. I told him about the affair too, because he deserved to know about that betrayal as well. Deserved to hear me apologize for failing him when he needed me most. I don't know if he could hear me or understand what I was saying, but somewhere in the middle of my confession, I felt his fingers tighten round mine. Just the smallest pressure, but enough to let me know that some part of him was still in there. Phil. Fighting to stay connected to the world he was being forced to leave. That's when the miracle happened. The thing that changed everything and gave me the strength to do what I knew I had to do. Orville opened his eyes. Not the vacant, unfocused stare I'd gotten used to over the past few months, but his real eyes. The ones that had looked at me with love and kindness for 16 years. His gaze was clear and alert, and when he tried to speak, his voice was weak, but unmistakably his own voice. Not the confused mumbling that had been coming out of him for so long. He told me he'd been aware of everything trapped inside his deteriorating body but still conscious, still listening, still understanding what was happening around. He said he'd known about the affair almost from the beginning, had seen the way Jethro looked at me, and the way I'd started looking back. But he'd also suspected that something wasn't right about his illness, that the progression was too steady, too predictable to be completely natural. The hardest part was when he told me he wasn't angry about the affair, that he understood how lonely and frightened I'd been, how natural it was to seek comfort in the arms of someone who seemed to care about me. He said he'd lived a long life and had been blessed with 2 good marriages, and if his illness meant that I found happiness with someone else, he could accept that as part of God's plan. But when I told him what I'd discovered about the poison, about Jethro's real motives, and the way he'd manipulated both of us, Orville's expression changed to something I'd never seen before. Wasn't anger exactly, but a kind of steely determination that reminded me of the man he'd been in his prime. A man who'd built a successful business from nothing and raised a family and earned the respect of everyone in Sparrow Creek. He told me what I needed to do, his voice getting stronger as he spoke, like the truth was giving him back some of the energy the poison had stolen from him. He said I needed to go to the police, needed to tell them everything, regardless of the consequences for myself. He said his life was almost over anyway, but mine wasn't, and I couldn't let Jethro get away with murder just to protect my reputation. But more than that, he was worried about what Jethro might do to me once he inherited the farm and didn't need me anymore. He said men who were capable of slowly poisoning their own fathers were capable of anything, and he couldn't bear the thought of leaving me alone and vulnerable with someone that dangerous. We talked for almost an hour, the longest conversation we'd had in months, planning what I would tell the authorities and how I would protect myself until Jethro could be arrested. Orville even told me where he'd hidden some cash in the house, money that wasn't in any of his bank accounts and that Jethro wouldn't know about, enough for me to get away if I needed to run. Just as we were finishing our conversation, we heard footsteps on the stairs. Orville squeezed my hand one more time and told me he loved me, that he'd always loved me and that he wanted me to be happy and safe after he was. Then he closed his eyes and went back to the shallow, labored breathing that had become his normal state, leaving me alone with the knowledge of what I had to do and the terrible understanding that I was about to lose the only ally I had in this fight. When Jethro appeared in the doorway a few seconds later, asking if everything was all right because he'd thought he'd heard voices, I looked up at him with a calmness I didn't know I possessed and told him that everything was fine, that I'd just been reading to Orville from his favorite book of Psalms. But inside, I was already preparing for war. The next morning brought a spring thunderstorm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old farmhouse, and I took it as a sign that God was preparing me for what I had to do. Made my decision during the long hours before dawn, sitting in that chair beside Orville's bed, watching him breathe and gathering the courage I'd need to see this through to the end. I waited until Jethro left to run errands in town. Then I called the sheriff's department and asked Deputy Collins, who'd gone to school with my late first husband, if he could come out to the farm to discuss a family matter. I didn't give him any details over the phone, just said it was urgent and that I needed to speak with someone I could trust. When Deputy Collins arrived an hour later, I was ready with the test results from Springfield, the samples I'd managed to save, and a written statement detailing everything I discovered about Jethro's plan. I told him about the affair too because Orville had been right that I couldn't hold anything back if I wanted the truth to come out. My voice shook when I got to that part, admitting my sins to a man who'd known me since I was a young widow, struggling to raise my children alone. But I forced myself to keep talking because this was bigger than my shame. Deputy Collins listened to everything without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail I revealed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying the test results and the timeline I'd written out. Then he asked me the question I'd been dreading: why I'd waited so long to come forward. Why hadn't called the police as soon as I suspected something was wrong. Told him the truth about that too. About how the affair had made me feel complicit, how I'd been afraid that no one would believe me, how I'd convinced myself that I might be wrong about what was happening. He nodded like he understood, then asked if I was prepared for what would come next, the investigation and the questions and the way people in town would talk about me once this all became public. I said I was ready because keeping silent would mean letting Jethro get away with murder, and I couldn't live with that on my conscience. But what happened next was something neither of us had anticipated. Deputy Collins asked if he could examine the medicine bottles himself, and I led him upstairs to Orville's room, where everything was still arranged exactly as Jethro had left it that morning. When we got there, the mysterious bottles were gone. All of the legitimate prescription medications were still there, lined up neat and proper on the dresser, but the two unlabeled bottles that had contained the poison were nowhere to be found. My heart sank as I realized what this meant. Jethro had suspected that I might go to the authorities, and he'd removed the evidence while I was sleeping or while he was pretending to run errands. Without those bottles, I had nothing but the test results from samples that could have come from anywhere, and my word against his about what I'd seen and where I'd found it. But then Deputy Collins did something that surprised me. Instead of looking disappointed or skeptical, he smiled and told me that he'd been hoping I'd come forward because they had been building a case against Jethro for months. Turned out that Jethro wasn't nearly as clever as he thought he was. The substances he'd been using to poison Orville were controlled compounds that required special permits to purchase, and the DA had been tracking their distribution for over a year as part of an investigation into illegal medical research. Jethro's name had come up on their radar when he'd made multiple purchases using fake veterinary credentials, claiming he needed the compounds for livestock research. The federal investigators had been waiting for him to make a mistake that would give them enough evidence to arrest him, and my testimony was exactly what they needed to move forward. They'd already been monitoring his communications, which explained how they knew about the phone conversation I'd overheard on the back porch. They knew about his plan, his timeline, even his strategy for using me as an unwitting accomplice. What they hadn't known was that Orville was still conscious and aware of what was being done to him, trapped inside a body that was slowly shutting down, but with his mind still intact enough to understand his situation. That information changed everything because it meant Orville could potentially testify against his son if his condition could be stabilized. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that felt like something out of a television show rather than my real life. Federal agents arrived to take over the investigation. Orville was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance with medical personnel who specialized in poison cases, and I found myself sitting in the sheriff's office giving statement after statement to investigators who seemed to know more about my situation than I did. The most shocking revelation came when they told me that Jethro wasn't actually adopted, as I'd always assumed. He was Orville's biological son, but he'd been told he was adopted when he was 18 years old as part of a cruel punishment for some transgression that Orville's first wife had insisted on. Orville had regretted that lie for years, but had never found the courage to correct it, and Jethro had built his entire sense of grievance and entitlement around the belief that he had no legitimate claim to his father's legacy. Irony was devastating. Jethro had slowly murdered the father, who'd always intended to leave him everything anyway, driven by a resentment based on a lie that had been told by a woman who'd been dead for over 20 years. By evening, Jethro was in custody, and Orville was in intensive care, where doctors were working to flush the remaining poison from his system and assess how much damage had been done to his organs. The prognosis wasn't good. Too much time had passed and too much poison had been administered for a complete recovery. But he was conscious and alert. And when I was finally allowed to see him, he was able to tell the investigators everything he'd observed and overheard during the months of his deliberate poisoning. 3 weeks later, Orville passed away peacefully in his sleep at the hospital, surrounded by friends from church and neighbors who'd come to pay their respects to a good man who'd been wronged in the worst possible way. His death was officially ruled a homicide, and Jethro was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and a dozen other federal crimes related to the illegal acquisition and use of controlled substances. I won't lie and say that the scandal didn't affect me. People in Sparrow Creek talked just like I'd known they would, and there were plenty of folks who thought I was just as guilty as Jethro, that I must have known what was happening and chosen to look the other way for my own benefit. Some of them still cross the street when they see me coming, still whisper when I walk into the grocery store or take my usual pew at Sunday service. But I'm still here, still standing, still breathing free air while Jethro sits in a federal prison cell, waiting for a trial that will likely end with him spending the rest of his life behind bars. I learned that survival isn't always pretty, that sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything you thought you cared about, but that you can live with the consequences when you know you chose courage over comfort. If my story has moved you, if it's made you think about the secrets people keep and the prices we pay for staying silent when we should speak up, then maybe you could share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose truth over safety. I'm still here in this old farmhouse tending Orville's grave and trying to make peace with the memories that live in these rooms. And I want to know that my words are reaching people who understand that even the darkest situations can have some kind of redemption if we're brave enough to reach for it. Tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know where my story is traveling, how far these words can go when someone decides to trust them with the truth. And if you think other people need to hear about finding strength in the hardest moments, well, I'd be honored if you'd help my voice find its way to their hearts too. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.